The two final speakers of what has been an exciting and informative 3 days. Teaming up to address the topic of color design layout in the Islamic garden, I welcome first International Award-winning expert in Asian urban history, Dr. MANU SOBTI. He joins us today all the way from the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, where his teachings and research pertain largely to the genesis and development of dwellings and city structures within Central and Eastern Asia. In the fall of 2010, he will add to a long list of publications a new book titled The Silver of the Oxus Borderland, Medieval Cultural Encounters Between the Arabs and the Persians. And next, I welcome Dr. Mohammad Gharpour. Dr. Gharpour joins us from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, where he teaches landscape and architectural history at this time. His life's work is focused on the lucrative topics of Persian garden history, both traditional and contemporary Japanese architecture, and restorative environments. And he is currently at work on yet another book manuscript, this one examining pavilion structures in Persian gardens. And so together, responsible for the publication of over 80 esteemed papers and 17 years of teaching, Dr. MANU SOBTI and Dr. Mohammad Gharpour are well equipped to close this third biannual symposium together in style. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming them to the floor.
Just gotta go back. I need the first slide. First, I would like to thank Qatar Foundation and VCU for this wonderful event, and especially Dr. Blair and Bloom for organizing such a wonderful symposium. Section 1, Introduction. Historical research has revealed tantalizing glimpses of Islamic garden environments through the course of time. While differing in arrangement and ensemble, context and patronage, all were salubrious environments par excellence, intended explicitly for the purposes of repose and enjoyment. But even the most detailed historical descriptions do little to provide the complete reconstruction of how these gardens may have actually engaged a visitor or interlocutor. How did these environments specifically provide the unique sensory stimuli that combine these senses? How and which colors were observed, what fragrances and aromas provided paradisial bliss. In its focus on reconstructing experience in the garden environment, this research argues that such spatial and particularly experiential reconstructions would necessitate a specific examination of color prevalent in the plant materials employed in these garden layouts. Towards this goal, it examines suggestions for color schemes, planting combinations, and design specifications within the proposed layouts of two historical gardens through extant manuals and manuscripts. Capturing the unique space-time continuum of an expanding Islamic world. The first was located on its eastern fringes of the Timurid Ecumene in 16th century Herat, known today through its agricultural manual, the Irshad al-Zara'a. While Abu Nasr Herawi's description may have been imaginary and therefore reflected an idealized Timurid garden, it is nevertheless tempting to employ it as a possible recipe for color palettes in the natural environment. Located westwards was the second and quintessentially Safavid Saadatabad, built by Shah Tahmasp in 16th century Qazvin, now known through Abdi Beg Shirazi's Jannatul Asmar. Few studies have specifically examined these two manuals for insights on the use of color within the landscape environments and how the arrangement of plants, flowers, fruits, and design elements may have potentially been based on an overarching color master plan. The change of seasons, gardening conventions, plant species, patronage, and upkeep would have radically altered how these environments progressively blossom and withered away. This research seeks to enhance some of these intriguing vignettes and propose a series of reconstructions that encompass descriptions of magical hue within the garden environment.
Section 2, Beauty in the Eyes of the Beholder. Within our purview of reconstructing experience, it is critical to consider two aspects in some detail. At a first level, this research reflects on how exactly a landscape space, such as the two gardens described, were perceived by the potential visitor. In this context, we define perception not just as the act of seeing and thereby creating a cognitive image, but also as the process of interpreting, reinterpreting, and thereafter recording. Furthermore, extending from its Latin etymology, perception is defined as perceptio, meaning to receive, collect, the act of taking possession, and apprehension with the mind or the senses. In his classic book, Examining Phenomenology in the Realm of Architectural Education, The Eyes of the Skin, Architecture and the Senses, Juhani Pallasmaa states how we seem to increasingly rely on our vision, perhaps most among all our five senses, to experience the external environment. Through faculties of our vision, we recognize shapes, movement, distance, perspectival relationships, and finally, color. Color vision supplements information and complements pleasure. To what we could get were the world to only appear as black and white. But color information and all its described virtues can also distract from certain features of a scene, such as shape and shades of light and dark, and affect perception of depth, enclosure, and volume within a field of consciously realized objects. In optical studies, for instance, there has emerged a marked proclivity for a flat, colored area to change its appearance when the color of its ground is changed. The juxtaposition of uniformly colored areas of different hue can lead to an interaction, intensify the perceived hue, simultaneous contrast. Placing a cool red adjacent to a warm red causes each perceived color to be altered, respectively to a greater coolness or warmness at the boundary. If the same two colors are used, one superimposed as a small area, the figure, over the other, the ground, the cool red is reviewed as bluish when the surround is warm red, while the warm red area is seen as orange red against the cool red ground. Similarly, in a three-dimensional context, if the cool and the warm red areas are separated increasingly from one another by a neutral field, the coolness and warmness become less perceptible. In arrangements of areas of different geometric shapes, colored red, yellow, and blue, presented on a neutral gray ground, the eye tends to link an area with another of the same color, rather than link areas having different colors but the same shapes. Finally, it appears that color also influences the judgment of distance and of the size in monocular perception. If a red cube is placed in a red surround, and an identical red cube is placed in a black one, and if both are at the same distance from the observer, the one on the red appears smaller and further away. Moving into the context of the landscaped environment, these observations imply that ways of seeing could be critically examined wherein color schemes were rendered through elements of built and soft landscape. Not only could color saturation and hue studies be attempted, so could figure and ground experiments using colors, plant materials, and reconstructed versions of context. Also, if color prescriptions and subsequently a color palette did actually exist, then the very act of thinking about color must indeed be an aspect of form and space at the onset of the design process. Current-day architectural design practice perpetuates the unfortunate misconception of material coloration as the penultimate phase of the design process. On the contrary, most building materials actually allow for honest colorations to be expressed from start, as do constitutive components of gardens and landscape elements, including plant materials and species. The conscious deployment of a color palette is therefore no happy accident, and this includes the ability to transmit design intention via deliberate arrangement and the positioning of artifacts, horizontal and vertical elements in architecture versus plant material in the garden. But most built artifacts, especially works of architecture, are made of durable and permanent material that survive time. Gardens, composed of soft and perishable elements of landscape, are relatively ephemeral, succumbing rapidly to the vicissitudes of time, seasonal changes, and varying cycles of patronage. Often little survives except for textual descriptions and circumstantial illustrations. Reconstructions must therefore be attempted from these sources, in addition to examining archaeology and a few surviving examples. Finally, in yet another pedagogical contrast from the entrenched traditions of architectural design, wherein the completed artifact displays preconceived colors, garden landscapes relish dynamic changes of colors with time and season, so much so that even the sense of space and volume undergoes a wide latitude of change, and with the changing character of plant materials. The so-called patina of age and time and architectural materials choices is now replaced by changes wrought by seasonal and growth cycles, imparting radical change to color renditions. Appropriate examples are the appearance and the disappearance of leaves, the blossoming and the withering away of flowers, the growth and the consumption of food. Furthermore, any and all of the above are the cause and effect of how the space and spirit of the garden is realized. As a second aspect of reconstructing experience, this research views phenomenology as not only connected to the notion of looking at what is being described, but in addition examining the cognitive processes at work in creating and interpreting this description. The experiential qualities of a design space are often exaggerated by the dynamics of sequential assemblies that are employed to collate these spaces. Since movement patterns engage these sequential assemblies in deliberate ways, designers consciously construct sequence within the designed artifacts they assemble, employing specific components that transmit particular kinds of narratives. Certain narratives transmit function, indicating how the spaces ought to be efficiently used. Other narratives frame communication and the sense of enclosure and envelope. Exterior versus interior, the whole versus the part. Still others allow the observer to effectively disengage from the outside world, move towards the inside, using the mass of the spaces as a filter for the senses. But sequential assemblies of spaces are not necessarily empirical in how they are put together. In other words, besides the so-called logic of functional necessity, which often determines the location of spaces, designers are also trying to translate their intent and narrative in spatial terms. How was the garden intended to be seen then? What themes were highlighted within its particular display? And what was the order of the observer's circulation? And how finally did its spaces, galleries, passages contain the displayed landscape and its colors? The so-called promenade architecturale is a device often employed to order sequence within a design project. Interestingly, the term promenade has its roots in landscape architecture and the perception of the external environment. Embedded within the promenade is the intention not to appreciate the given environment from any single vantage point, as may be the case in an enclosed space, but rather to have an experience that constantly evolves as one moves through it. The concept of the promenade architecturale is therefore predicated on the ideas of movement and sequence. Interpretations are found in the work of several designers, including Viollet-le-Duc's idea of the mise-en-scène, Le Corbusier, who is actually credited with coining the term, Frank Lloyd Wright, and Peter Collins, who saw the phenomena of the parallax as an equivalent. Finally, the movement of the observer holds great significance in Calvino's Invisible Cities, wherein multiple narratives, such as the ones in a garden, document an imaginary dialogue between Marco Polo and Kublai Khan. The structure of the book, as the structure of the garden, compels one to literally reinvent how each narrative is viewed, versus the normative tendency to view the ascending order of the pages, read cover to cover, move from beginning to the end. Sequential mapping is quickly sacrificed by the reader, by the visitor, giving way to a careful reading of individual narratives. Despite the intuitive and often growing sense of similarity between several episodes that occur through the course of the book and through the course of the visitation to the garden. In its best possible scenario, this described spatial promenade creates a palpable tension between idealized spatial arrangements and the multiple sensations that trigger as one moves in relationship to them. Planted on the basis of an underlying orthogonal plan, the assumed promenade through the trees of the garden, described in the two texts, had several variations: the perpendicular, the parallel, the diagonal, the zigzag. Several spatial typologies existed under the tree, within the alleyways, alongside the Kola Farangi or the Chehel Setun, and next to the defined perimeter wall. All these typologies effectively exaggerated by the changing plant materials and their multiple hues. Most, if not all, of these spaces could be viewed both from within and without, assuming that plantscape oscillated between becoming a transparent, translucent, shimmering, and opaque wall of vegetation. Finally, assuming that orthogonality was indeed an important design idea for the Char Bagh, the longer and the shorter axis of the garden setting facilitated vastly different spatial experiences, exaggerated by the sense of enclosure provided by the different tree and plant species.
Section 3, Space-Time Nexus as encapsulated in the Irshad al-Zira'a and the Jannat al-Asmar. The two texts at the center of this research were produced within specific conditions of geopolitics in space and time. First among the two, the Irshad al-Zira'a, or the Handbook of Agriculture, written in Persian by Qasim Yusuf Abu Nasr Heravi, was completed in 1515 in Herat, Afghanistan. Agriculture, and more specifically horticulture, seems to have been the compendium's focus. However, based on the edition produced by Moshiri in 1966 and 7, this voluminous tome comprising of a muqaddama preface followed by a main text, 8 chapters, which are called Rosa, in length, also demonstrated Heravi's overt expression of his Shia faith. Heravi extols the lingering splendors of the bygone Timurid era, mentioning the sultans Shah Rukh and Abu Said, but not the Safavid Shah Ismail, or for that matter, any among the Shaybanids. One more significant observation on the Irshad, which must be mentioned, is in its precision of narrative description in its last, which is 8th chapter, which is entitled Laying Out a Chahar Bagh, or large-scale walled garden. This 8th chapter contains measurements of garden elements, names of 4 plant species, and even notes on the particular order of planting of these species within the confines of a garden setting. Significantly, while the Irshad al-Zira'a's completion in 1515 came 9 years after Sultan Hossein Baigara's demise. It came just 2 years after the Safavids had gained the decisive influence in Herat. Within this changing socio-political milieu, Yaqubi believes that the main concern of Heravi's Muqaddama was the presentation of agriculture as an economically as well as socially and even transcendentally important realm of Islamic society. In Heravi's words, quote, "In this world, agriculture and horticulture, زراعت نمودن و درخت کاشتن, precede all other arts or sanaya, as both bring blessings in this and the other world," quote. In essence, while Heravi keenly observed the plant world via his irshad, he also aggrandized the polyglot Abu Nasr Shaybani, whose broad interests both in literature and agriculture were viewed favorably. On closer examination, the irshad may be then viewed as a literal commentary on a prevailing social ideal, and that Heravi so realized in the intellectual and cultural life of Timurid Herat. Was the text then compiled to encourage this ideal or to prescribe the normative practices of this kind of society? Did the Irshad collate a motley collection of knowledge on agriculture, as some scholars have contended? Or was the Chahar Bagh hence described the quintessential garden? These insights were compared with Sabtelani's revelation of Heravi's proximity to the prolific miracle Sayyid Qiyas, reflect on why the Irshad was written. Qiyas was the prominent Timurid landscape architect, gardener, and agronomist, and may have provided Heravi with exemplars for inclusion within his compendium. Yet, rather than be the description of any specific garden built by Mirak, or a potential model or classical type, there is reason to infer that Heravi's seemingly incomplete description, also noticed by Sabtelani, was more correctly a prescription for a series of garden modules that could be replicated as many times as necessary to create a garden of any desired size, but based on the fundamental Chahar Bagh plan. While Heravi's connections to Mirak was understandably complex, given the history of the later vis-a-vis Mughal garden history, it is still largely unknown why the Irshad was composed and for what client and patronage. In extension, where Heravi's choice of plantings, including plant and tree species and landscape, often described with precision, unlikely random choices, or were these acknowledgement of prevalent collective traditions amongst gardeners on planting species and garden combinations. Seen in this light, the Irshad was therefore the propagation of noble lifestyle with the principles similar to those espoused in yet another text, the Bayazid Khoshbui, the sweet-smelling notebook, popular as a primer with Shah Jahan Ahmad's Mughal elite in the mid-17th century. In contrast to the Irshad, the Jannatul Asmar, the third book in the five-volume called the Jannatul Adnan, literally the Garden of Eden, was produced within a different cultural context. Its writer, Khaja Zainul Abidin Ali Abdi Beyk Shirazi, was born probably in the city of Tabriz, and interestingly, in the year 1515, which coincided with the year the Irshad was completed, the year when the Irshad was completed. Shirazi served as a mid-level accountant in the Safavid bureaucracy before retiring to Ardabil, where he died in 1580 or 1581. Although a brilliant and creative poet, he never appears to have been credited in the history of Persian literature as much as his contemporaries like Muhtasham Kashani and Vahshi Bafqi. Though amongst the few descriptions of a garden project connected to a particular patron, place, and event, Shirazi's work was neglected by most Persian scholars, to be finally edited by Rahimov and published in Moscow in 1979. Following this publication, Lozensky was the first scholar to systematically analyze the structure, syntax, content, and methodology of classification applied in Shirazi's poetry to describe Tahmasp's garden and pavilion. Interestingly, Lozensky extols this book as one of the longest and richest works of descriptive poetry in the medieval Near Eastern literary tradition. For all purposes, Shirazi's mentioned book celebrated Shah Tahmasp's new palace complex of Saodatabad, built in the luxurious suburb of Jafarabad, located east of the city of Qazvin. In the description of the Saodatabad suburban garden, Shirazi explained that its pavilion, or gasr, not only accommodated Tahmasp and members of his entourage, but also served as his administrative center. Significantly, the garden complex was also used by Tahmasp's son, Shah Abbas, who added several gardens and pavilions along the new street of Chaharbagh in Isfahan. It is therefore the description of a real garden and not prescriptive in the manner of Haravi's Irshad.
Section 4, Fragments of Imagination. Though composed specifically for Shah Tahmasp, Shirazi's work should not be dismissed merely as a vanity publication supported by a lavish, if otherwise disinterested, patron. In its elaborate narrative that closely emulated Nizami Ganjavi's Khamsa by spanning 5 narrative poems and 4,100 verses composed in specific meter, Shirazi introduces a striking innovation into this easily recognizable pattern. While each part of the Jannat-e-Adan was in a different meter, the 5 volumes were clearly designed to be communicated as a comprehensive whole, communicating one single story about Tahmasp's palace garden complex. This single story that incites the reader's unbroken attention is rendered through the unusual trope of 4 annual seasons: spring, summer, autumn, and fall, and the remarkable changes inflicted by each of these seasons on the space of the garden complex. This deliberately discontinuous synchronic and diachronic space-time framework allegorically represented the palace gardens as an eternal paradise. These gardens and their paradise-like qualities were viewed through the lenses of time, within which Shirazi rather self-consciously leads the eye of the viewer or the reader through the best parts of the complex in a conceptual promenade of sorts. In addition to the seasonal pattern rendered in the Khamsa, the middle 3 volumes of Shirazi's work focuses on 3 distinct modes of temporality that introduce the eternal palace in the conflated realm of 3 notions of time: the cultural, the natural, and the historical. In its unusual description, which Lozensky describes as descriptio, which fuses the spatial and the visual objects of Tahmasp's garden complex into the temporal and verbal flow of poetry, the Irshad al-Zira and the Jannat al-Asmar provide information on color stimuli on the Persian garden in varied ways. While the former provides a vignette into the prescription of a garden typology potentially combinable and permutable, the latter explain this to the space-time description of an existing garden in the suburbs of Qazvin. Both were historically attributable to significant personalities in the history of Persian garden literature, but at one point both radically diverged. Initially seen as a potential disadvantage, this diversion was soon realized as an advantage. While the Irshad could be interpreted as a moment in the development of garden development, frozen in the frame of time, the Jannat was time decoded as a series of discontinuous collage-like frames bound within the framework of a khamsa. Both discussed ways of seeing and the designed, pleasurable garden environment, interpreting color information via architectonic and plant species description. Most significantly, both challenge the reader or the viewer to move along with the narrative. The Irshad, via how it defines space, place, and plant materials prescriptively, the Jannat, while how it created a cognitive map of Shah Tahmasp's grand palace complex far removed from its physical mapping. In revisiting two critical themes, the cycle of time progression and the concept of the promenade or progression through narratives as aspects facilitating varied cycles of experience, both are related to the perception of color within the garden environment. The writers of the Irshad al-Zira and the Jannat al-Asmar were situated in somewhat differing time zones. Qazwin, roughly southwest of the Caspian Sea, versus Herat, situated beyond the fringes of Eastern Central Asia. Shirazi's poetic rendition of the spaces of the palace complex, with its 18 species of plants, including 8 melon species, viewed through the progression of the 4 seasons, was aptly paralleled by Abu Nasr Harawi's description of plant species within the space of his charbagh, including 19 species and no melons. So looking at the aspects of time and the seasons. Reaching summer, the tree completely in bloom, looking at the overlap of the trees together. Winter again, spring, beginning of summer, more leaves, fruits, and flowers. Autumn descends, fall, and winter again. Finally, the amount of space within the garden, the amount of space that was observed by the viewer, by the visitor, in terms of figure and ground, the overlapping trees, the space of the trees, the space of the observer. Assuming the typical seasonal weather cycle in and around Herat would have included dry, hot, cloudless summers and severe winters, Harawi obviously expected garden layouts in other regions, including Central Asia, Iran, and India, to be variations on the same theme, conditions by the limitations imposed by climatic cycles. His described garden in the Irshad was walled, roughly rectangular, its main pavilion or imarat positioned south and facing north. The main water course flowed through the center of the garden into a pool that faced the pavilion, complemented by an irrigation channel that ran along the inner perimeter of the garden walls. The pool was set into the raised platform or dais in which the platform itself stood. While this is about as far as the description of architectural elements contained in the Irshad, the exactly described plant species are a different matter. Harawi is quite particular while describing plant species and consequent coloration for calculated visual impact. Poplars along the garden borders were to be followed by apple trees to the south of the pavilion, thereafter mulberry, cherry, judas, fig, dog rose as one proceeded northwards, creating a literal forest around the pavilion. Then came 9 garden beds, bagchas, arranged with flowers that bloomed in quick succession, one after another. Following these garden beds and still proceeding northward were terraces of pomegranate, pear, peach, nectarine, and quince. Finally, at the northernmost border of the garden was located the apricot and plum trees, and then the poplars again. And if this was our reconstruction in black and white with all the species of trees drawn up carefully, this is what we saw in color as a manuscript drawing, looking at it the way a manuscript drawing would have been created. Accordingly, the sequence of activities, events, and views of this garden would have played out in diverse ways for each distinct season. Given the color palette implicitly suggested in Haravi's writing, the advent of the winter would have seen all tree and shrub species suggested, including fruit varieties such as apple, mulberry, cherry, red Judas, sour cherry, fig, dog rose, poplar, pear, quince, nectarine, peach, pomegranate, apricot, plum, and shrub species, including cucumber, calendula, red rose, iris, trefoil, lose their leaves. Devoid of their green garb, the trees would have appeared as dark, silhouette-like frameworks against the pale snow cover on the ground, exaggerating the stillness of winter. The fountains would be inoperable, the canals frozen, the garden as an inhospitable place for the rare visitor who dared undertake the arduous journey in the cold season. Early fall would also be the time when the appointed gardeners would prune and trim the trees in anticipation for the growth spurt which would begin at the end of the frost. The gray, ash-colored sky and the occasional winter storm would do little to enhance the grays and the dark browns of this particular environment. So looking at the garden in color and looking at one particular part in that red rectangle in a little more detail and the species of the trees within them. Looking at a little more detail with the pavilion and the trees around it. And then zooming into the pavilion itself. In contrast to this profound activity of the summer, the arrival of spring would impart radical changes to this environment. Several tree and shrub species would sprout leaves overnight, their multiple hues of green transforming under the filter of longer sunlit days. The melting snow would reveal dark brown soil ready to receive new plantings and grafts and redecorations, while mulberry, cherry, red Judas, fig, dog rose, plum, red rose, iris, and trefoil would only sport green leaves in multiple shades. Most significantly, a large number of fruit species would sprout flowers in spring, their colors far removed from the colorations of the subsequent fruits. These included the distinctive was for the ubiquitous poplars bordering the wall, in all probability the Safidare Samarkandi, yellow flowers for the cucumber, green flower buds for calendula, white flowers for peach, light pink flowers for quince, white-red flowers for nectarine, pink flowers for peach, crimson for pomegranate, and light pink for apricot. This riot of colors was matched by the bright blue sky, sharp light, and the semi-transparent quality of the vegetation versus the filigree-like conditions of the winter. In summary, this spring garden in Haravi's imagination was a luxurious canvas of green with generous spots of color. The garden of delight now also was the garden of sweet smell. In the next avatar of this particular environment, the summer season with its long-awaited extended visitations would finally arrive. The fruit-laden trees with their thick leaf covers and contrasting dark light areas of shade and shadow would create short vistas and contained views, facilitating the union of romantics and poets, the gathering of ripe fruit and the viewing of flowers. While visual pleasure was now effectively enhanced by haptic experience, the space of the garden was no longer one space but several, no longer one narrative but multiple, no longer one vista but many. The red, green, blue, the red, green, yellow of the apples would appear alongside the green, purple of the tute bedana or the mulberry, red and light orange cherry, pink, red Judas, green, purple fig, light pink dog rose, green cucumber with yellow flowers, orange calendula, green red pear, ripe golden yellow quince, orange nectarine, light orange peach, crimson pink anar or pomegranate, orange apricot, deep purple plum, and the delicate yellow trefoil. In a last seasonal wonder before the arrival of the cold season, autumn retransformed the garden to a mix of green shades interspersed with patches of bright hue, in particular the red of the blossoming Judas tree with brown seed pods, the pomegranate-shaped crimson hips of the dog rose, the marvelous flowers of the red rose, or the gul-e surkh, and finally the violet wonders of the delicate iris. Persian gardens were therefore facilitators of colored experience, preciously maintained teleporting devices that defined specific spatial experiences. Not surprisingly, scholars have frequently identified gardens as properties, literally as real estate, a view confirmed by the comprehensive review of Persian poetry, which paints a dominant materialistic view of gardens and pavilions. Ferdowsi, for example, describes the fresh and the decorated Ivan as a symbol of wealth and happiness. Similarly, Kashani talks about the value of gardens as properties, and he writes, "In life, thieves are always lying in ambush to grab you, wife, children, property, house, store, and garden." These urban and suburban creations were also identified via their physiological benefits as places for relaxation and restoration. The close terminology used to describe sightseeing within the garden, tamasha, and walking, gardish, makes it challenging to differentiate these experiences in poetry. Tabrisi writes, "The point of roaming in the garden is to get upset. In fact, our real pleasant garden is inside the house." Lahiji talks about watching transformations in the garden and writes, "There have been springs, now watch the autumn in the garden." A few more views of this particular garden and sectional views of the plan that we had reconstructed in color, this being the long section through the garden, you seeing the canal at the center and the trees that border on all sides. Zoomed views of how those trees would sit on the landscape. A section cut through the pavilion itself. And then a painterly view of what the garden would have looked like. And one more section which evaded us in terms of completion. And finally, a picture that came in late, the Kola Farangi, or the Chehel Sutun, at the center of the gardens in Qazvin, which still survives, which is quite tempting, and that's why we put these images here, a view from the outside and a view from the inside with all its stained glass, which might be a reconstruction, but which in some ways says that the colors on the inside are the colors on the outside. When Timur laid siege to Herat in 1380, it was a relatively compact city, with cemeteries and suburbs outside its gardens and a restricted area of estates just beyond. Terry Allen writes that towards the end of the 15th century, the Herati urban aristocracy had begun to increasingly turn away from institutions within the walls and its immediate surroundings to their own preserves, the baghs, the takhs, the gumbads, positioned at the northern edge of the oasis. They created for themselves exclusive suburban districts containing residual and recreational spaces located at vantage points some distance from the city. The only rationale that governed these schemes was the view of the city itself, obtained by means of elevated viewpoints, precedents of which existed in Timur's garden in the Takht-e-Karas Pass overlooking the city of Shakhrisyabs, now in Uzbekistan. True to their purpose, most of these complexes were situated in the foothills north of Herat, where there was a sense of both being within and without the city, while Haravi's described gardens could have been located anywhere around Herat or beyond. With its seasonal cycles of colors and the possibilities of changing experience, it was then a frame to view and extend the experience of this particular kind of extending city. To finally return to phenomenology, we refer to Merleau-Ponty's notion of profane vision discussed in his Eye and Mind, wherein the sensory, motor, and intersensory, more especially visual tactile, equivalences are exploited by the painter and perceived in very different ways. In profane or ordinary vision, it is as though experience goes straight to the object and misses those pre-objective attributes of depth, texture, and overlap, without which vision could not give us a full-bodied spatial thing. Ordinary vision is made by this means, and I quote, "to see a space and things included therein," unquote. End of quote. But it works in us without us. It hides itself in making the object visible. The visible in the profane sense forgets its premises. These means to vision are not seen in order that objects may be seen according to them. They exist only as at the threshold of profane vision. In fact, they are not seen by everyone. These invisibles or barely visibles of ordinary vision are the proper objects of the painter's gaze. The painter's vision anticipates within things the labor of ordinary vision. It breaks up the human perceptual world in an effort to find those pre-things that will become visible objects, to capture the secret genesis of things. Merleau-Ponty contends that this pre-human way of seeing things is the painter's way, since that which our vision uses anonymously, seemingly without us, the painter must personally see. We argue together that the exalted Sultan visiting the garden in Qazvin, in Herat, and elsewhere, his entourage, frequent foreign ambassadors, the empowered gardeners and horticulturalists, the bonded day laborers and masons who worked on the project, and finally the scribe who described this object, this artifact, were indeed seeing the world in the ways of the painter. They were seeing the world of the paradise-like garden in its multiple avatars of changing hue. And we have two little charts here with the species of the plants and all the colors in fall, spring, summer, and autumn. And I know it's small, it may not reach you. And then we have another chart on the phenomena within these gardens in terms of fall, spring, summer, and autumn. Thank you.